CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Enhanced cooperation among emerging markets and developing countries is the calling of the times. And so the 9th annual BRICS Summit, scheduled for September the 3rd to the 5th in Xiamen City in southeast China's Fujian province, is expected to provide more opportunities for emerging economies and injecting impetus into economic globalization. The 5 BRICS countries represent over 3.6 billion people, around 40% of the world's population, and have a combined nominal GDP of more than $16 trillion. So what can be done to help the bloc continue its tradition of carrying out dialogue and cooperation with other emerging markets? And what other outcomes can be expected from the 2017 BRICS Summit? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, China is gearing up for the 2017 BRICS Summit to be held in the coastal city of Xiamen. The world's 5 biggest emerging economies contributed to half of the world economic growth in 2016. Well, researchers under China's top economic planning body, the NDRC, and the Ministry of Commerce held a media briefing earlier this week on the increasingly important role BRICS countries have played over the past 10 years. CGTN's Xiao Yunfei has more.
The BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They make up more than 40% of the world's total population. Researchers say many achievements were made since the group was formed.
The mechanism of BRICS in the past 10 years has promoted the development of trade, emerging markets, and developing countries. It also played a key role in promoting the development of a global economy.
The BRICS countries' share of the global economy is 23%, an 11 percentage point increase in less than a decade. Their proportion of international trade is 16%, and the proportion of foreign investment has increased to 12%. Analysts say the BRICS summit in Xiamen will be a good opportunity to narrow differences and expand cooperation. In recent years, the BRICS countries have strengthened their communications and cooperation on their finance and economy. The 5 countries have co-founded a new development bank, which has made adequate achievements in its first 2 years. The bank has played a key role in improving global governance of sustainable development. Zhao Yunfei, CGTN, Beijing.
Well, Xiamen is located in southeastern China's Fujian province. CGTN's Uche Okoronkwo is already there and will be giving us a front row seat to all the action as the summit progresses.
The 2017 BRICS Summit kicks off in just a few days, right here in the beautiful port city of Xiamen in China's southern Fujian province. Now, the focus this time around will be on building stronger partnerships as well as further developing cooperation in key sectors of the economy amongst the different BRICS countries. Now, for China, the host, they're adopting a global approach this time around, inviting several non-member states to participate. This includes countries like Egypt, Guinea, Mexico, Thailand, and even Tajikistan. For Africa, the BRICS countries have become the largest trading partner for the continent, as well as a significant investor in sectors such as manufacturing, as well as services. For the continent, this BRICS summit will be all about charting the way forward and creating win-win partnerships. Uche Okoronkwo, CGTN, Xiamen.
And now to offer further insights into the BRICS grouping and the upcoming summit, I have expert guests standing by. In Beijing, Professor Liu Shiqing, he's a senior fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. And with me in studio in Nairobi's Ali Khan Sachu, he's the CEO of Rich Management. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Professor Liu, let me start off with you because you're following the developments from China here. The BRICS grouping summit will be held in Xiamen in the coming week. It has been said by officials that this is a golden decade. It is entering a golden decade. So just how different has the BRICS grouping been, though, over the last decade from other groups?
I think the whole world now is looking closely to see the event that happened in China. And as we know that the BRICS role in the world stage is becoming important with time passing every year. So from the figures, we can see that at the very beginning, 2009, the GDP of BRICS countries had only occupied 16% of the world GDP. Now, the 10 years after, so we have already reached the 22% of this total global GDP. That means the importance of the BRICS countries are becoming very, very acute now for the whole world economic growth. As we know that the BRICS are playing more important role to promote and to boost the economic development, especially to promote this economic growth in recent time,
right,
when we have many challenges.
Right. Ali Kantachu, I'll get your views here, because the BRICS, as it's sounding, the role is becoming more and more important. What are we seeing in terms of its differences, though, with other groups such as NAFTA, with other groups coming along?
So I think it's a very interesting geopolitical moment. You've got Washington, which has become an epicenter of global risk right now under President Trump. And this is an ideal opportunity for the BRICS grouping to step up to the plate and, in fact, look to take leadership around the world today. They're not going to get another opening like they're getting now. And I think that's why we've seen such a lot of fanfare, such a lot of talk, discussion. This is the moment I think President Xi Jinping takes the BRICS right onto the world stage from a political point of view. Economically, we know it's become far more important. But there are a couple of points I would like to touch on. You know, it's not entirely monolithic. What do I mean by that? Within BRICS, at its beating heart, you have this slight difference between India and China. That's been resolved ahead of this, that standoff on the plateau was resolved. But here we have China taking leadership. They're building a global trading system, one belt, one road. I saw the foreign ministers say, look, this 2014 to 2016, one belt, one road countries contributed $2 trillion worth of trade.
Right.
That is the economic heartbeat of the world today, and that's what I find very interesting.
Aside looking at the economic heartbeat, though, and let's go back briefly over the last 10 years, and some of the original goals of BRICS, though, one of them was about global governance, and the other one was about, you know, enhancing South-South cooperation. If you go back to those ideals, though, how much of those have been met?
So I think corporate governance, we've had a lot of talk about it. I'm not sure how much we've seen implemented on that front. I tend to think that, you know, for example, take Africa, where the Chinese involvement had many different nodes. Today, one feels it's more centralized under the leadership of the president, and there's a much more focus. So I think you're seeing governance improve across the BRICS countries. It's never going to be linear. You get ups and downs. Look what was happening in South Africa. Lots of challenges in different jurisdictions, but overall, the trend is going better. That's for certain. Regarding South-South cooperation, this has been a silver bullet, right, particularly for places like Africa. Look at the trade, China-Africa, India-Africa, Brazil, Lusophone. You've seen a big exponential increase there. Very, very positive development.
Right. Professor Liu, you mentioned the important role that the BRICS has been playing over the last 10 years. And if you look back, though, at its biggest manifestation, because you did mention how much of the GDP that they are providing here, the biggest economic manifestation of the BRICS for you, what would that be?
I think the BRICS has found a new way that to develop its economy, and especially to find a right way to raise funds and financing supported by themselves. As we know that in China we have a very important philosophy that to rely on ourselves to develop our economy. So that's why the NDB is established. The purpose of the NDB bank is not to replacing the available the international institutions like the World Bank or the IMF, because they are still playing important role in the world economy. But the NDB is a complementary measure that to deal with the difficulties and the challenges we have. As we know that in the world that we have a very famous word in the world that all words are going to Rome. That means every opportunity, every chance can get the same goal. So with the NDB, we are very confident that to raise funds by ourselves and to rely on ourselves, we can overcome all these difficulties we have met in the future, especially to deal with fund requirement for infrastructure projects and other social projects in the near future. So this is very important for BRICS countries.
Right, the new development bank.
Yes, so I think this is an important point the professor's making. He's talking about complementarity. I mean, there were some hopes, high-blown hopes that we could reinvent the entire financial architecture. We can't. The IMF has a role, World Bank has a role, but here what we have is a decision-making organism that springs out of the BRICS countries, springs out of that understanding that came from China, lifting millions out of poverty. And I think that's going to make a very significant difference. The other thing that I really am impressed with is the amount of work that China in particular, the amount of money China is putting to work through the bank and in general. And it is that money that's being put to work which is reordering the financial system. Today, frontier economies like Kenya, Sri Lanka, if you go and look, where is the capital coming from? So much of it is now coming out of China and effectively will come out of the new BRICS Bank as well. Right.
The new development bank, though, Professor Liu, how different is the model? How is that shaping up as opposed to the other multilateral financiers?
I think it's a good question, because for the BRICS countries, we need multiple international financial institutions and also financing support from all over the world, especially with some international institutions like the World Bank and also the European Central Bank, even ADB. So we have so many opportunities, especially with a new established new bank, AIIB, that we can have more chances, opportunities to raise funds to support the BRICS financial reports. But at the moment, we have to say that the risk management is so very crucial for all the BRICS countries. At the moment, as we know that the financial situation in Western nations, developed nations, are not so well managed. So we are facing the very serious challenges in dealing with all these hidden risks, especially in financial and banking sectors. So we have to closely cooperate and coordinate each other with all members of the BRICS countries to cover and to overcome all these problems and the disputes we have, to deal with all these risks, to avoid any possible or similar problem as America had 10 years before. So to avoid any possible financial crisis. As we know, that BRICS countries still are very sensitive to the financial problems.
Professor Liu, we'll leave it there for the moment, and Ali Kansach, do stay with us. We'll continue with this in a moment. We're going to take a short break now, but when we return, we'll have more insight into the upcoming BRICS Summit. Do stay with us.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa is looking to the BRICS Summit for stronger cooperation in economic and trade relations as it braces for an industrial revolution.
The United States is not a member of BRICS, but it certainly feels the impact of development. This is a critical time for the world, with communication and the exchange of ideas perhaps more important than ever before.
It's been 10 years of cooperation for the BRICS group, and Xiamen is ready to be the starting point for more to come.
Stronger partnership for a bright future for everyone from everywhere. Join us, the 2017 BRICS Summit on CGTN.
呼吁建设开放型的世界经济。
The 5 countries have been calling for open and inclusive economic cooperation and governance, which dominated the discussion of the Hamburg G20 summit. The bloc has also been dedicated to securing multilateralism and world peace. We have set up a mechanism of discussion over international issues based in New York, Geneva, and Vienna on a regular basis so as to increase the voice of the 5-member bloc.
That was Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi speaking at a BRICS summit press briefing earlier this week. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, Egypt is one of the non-BRICS members that will be attending this year's summit in China. The country has close economic and political ties with 3 of the members, China, India and Russia. Yasser Hakim looks at what the Egyptian president is expected to discuss at the summit.
Egypt is the only Arab state to be invited to the BRICS summit so far. It's a sign of the strong relationship with China, since both sides signed a strategic partnership agreement in Beijing in 2014.
China strongly supports Egypt as a strategic ally by inviting it to such major economic events and gatherings. China personally invited Egypt to the G20 summit. Egypt was active in the summit, which opened a lot of doors for economic relationships.
Egypt is also a leading partner in the Belt and Road Initiative, and it can play a major role in linking up BRICS' global trade.
We are the center of the world because we are signatories to the COMESA, another fantastic regulatory economic unity on the African continent. And we're trying to expand that and be part of a greater Africa as well. We're part of the GAFTA and the PAFTA with the Middle East. We're part of the association agreement with Europe. We've got the QIZ protocol with the United States of America. We've got a free trade agreement with Turkey. We are part of a lot of other of these international agreements.
Apart from the economic aspect, India wants to discuss the counter-terrorism efforts at the summit. India wants the BRICS to launch an anti-terrorism convention at the UN. Egypt itself is in a war on terrorism, so it would very much welcome such a move.
It is happening again now as China invites Egypt, this time to attend the BRICS and open new venues for the country's economy. Egypt always calls for cutting financial and logistical support to terrorist groups. Terrorism does not spread by thought only, but it needs funding which is provided by several nations. That has to be stopped.
According to experts here, Egypt attending the BRICS this year could have a significant impact on its economic and political development. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
And we continue our discussion now, and I still have my expert guest standing by in Beijing, Professor Liu Shichin. He's a senior fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. With me in studio in Nairobi, Alikan Sachu, CEO of Rich Management. South Africa here is the only African member of the BRICS grouping here, although Kenya and Egypt have been invited to attend this year's BRICS summit in Beijing, in China, in Xiamen, in China. South Africa has been in recession. Its economy has been struggling over the last couple of years. How beneficial has it been for the BRICS to have South Africa in there? And how beneficial has it been for South Africa dealing with the BRICS?
I think it's been entirely beneficial for South Africa to deal with the BRICS in its current situation. As you correctly said, the economy has been in the slow lane, close to 0% GDP expansion. I'm expecting a better performance this year because they had good rains and there's been a recovery in metals prices. But I think, you know, if you look at South Africa has benefited far more from the connection. It's the smallest economy in those 5. In terms of size, it's a statistical irrelevance in many ways. But it was a political statement that was made by BRIC to say, look, Africa is this huge continent. You were telling me earlier that Kenya and Egypt had been invited to this conference. And I think that's an important point. What you're seeing here is more diversification. Once upon a time, South Africa was the gateway to Africa. And what you're seeing here is BRICS appreciate that maybe that time is now past and they need to get more representation from the East, from the North, and from the West. And I think we're seeing South Africa being diluted a little bit as we move forward.
Right. Professor Liu, your take on that, South Africa's membership of the BRICS, and of course other BRIC members have been suffering economically as well, Brazil being the other of the BRIC members that has been suffering. How important has this grouping been for those countries that have had financial crisis?
I think we have two possibilities. One is that all these countries who have financial difficulties or crisis, they have to find out the real reason for these problems. And in order to find a solution, they have to structure or restructure their financial institutions and the system. And the second, they have to strengthen the supervision and the monitoring system to cover all these risks. Especially, they have to comply with all these standards and requirements that according to the international law and the international practices. But actually, at the moment, in the BRICS countries, especially the relations with African countries, we have to know each other about the financial requirements, financial situation, and to avoid any possible serious financial crisis in the near future, because the African countries are so sensitive and our economic overall situation is very weak, so cannot withstand any financial crisis. So this must be a strong point, a major issue to be discussed among the African countries. As we know that Africa is a continent with a huge population. They have rich, talented people there and also skilled people there, but they need a good market, a well-managed market. China is a well-managed market for African countries. So at the moment, I think for African countries, they need more efforts to have so-called supply-side structure reform in order to meet the more demand from China.
And I will come back to you, Ali Khan, because in 2013, during the BRICS meeting in Africa, which was in South Africa there, South Africa had talked about infrastructure being one of the key priorities for African countries, and it was hoped that the new development bank would be a catalyst for assisting African countries in meeting their infrastructure financing deficit, which stands at about $100 million a year or so. How much of that has come to fruition, though, for African countries?
No, I haven't seen much of that money being put to work through the development bank yet. I saw a lot of money being given by China to the African Development Bank that was then putting that money to work in infrastructure. So we've yet to see the money. We've yet to see the rubber hit the tracks. We're going to see that in the next 12 to 18 months. There's a lot of excitement. There's a strong pipeline, and I expect that to hit it in a big way. There are a couple of things I'd like to come back talking about China-Africa. Of course, Beatrice, the China-Africa engagement happened in the 15th century with a Chinese admiral called Zheng He who came here, and that was the first engagement. Then we had this high-velocity engagement from the early 2000s, what people like to call the China-Africa Trade Corridor, got as high as $200 billion and it's come off a little bit. But Jack Ma, the executive chairman of Alibaba, was here recently, and he turned at a presentation I was at, and he said, you know, you guys have got to look at the new China-Africa corridor. He said, it's now going to be an e-commerce. It's going to be a completely different relationship. I think we're at this touching point, this breakthrough moment, when the whole of our engagement between each other, BRICS and Africa, Africa and China, is about to change in a very dynamic way.
We are seeing, of course, a lot of engagement going back and forth, and as I did mention earlier, that Kenya, Egypt now will be attending the BRICS summit there, and Guinea as well. The chair of the African Union, the president, will be there. What is the leverage, though, that Africa can bring to this?
This is a big problem for us because we are like 54 letterboxes. China has one letterbox, the President Xi Jinping. And negotiating our position, getting coordination has been a complex issue. And I think going forward, China appreciates this and is looking for us to connect better in order to get more leverage at the negotiating table. I think as Africans, we've got to learn a lesson here from the Chinese, that really you need a unitary command one commander-in-chief when it comes to these types of negotiations. And I think that's what's going to happen going forward. But I think what we're seeing, unfortunately, in South Africa's case is a dilution of their voice and an increase in the voices of those African countries which represent each corner of the continent.
Right. Professor Liu, we're going to wind up in a minute, but let's look ahead at next week's summit now and what concerns that Africa are likely to be taking to the summit. What do you see coming out in terms of partnerships, in terms of deals, in terms of dialogue that will be moving these forward?
As we know that this BRICS summit in Xiamen will discuss at least 100 different issues, and we signed many contracts or agreements during the meeting. So especially the relations with the Africa will be really improved and also increased this from the space and also from the speed of the development now. At the moment, as we know that the financial support will be one of the major hottest point between China and African countries. As we know that China already issued some African funds and African development funds also will provide billions of the US dollars to support African development. So how to use these funds effectively and also how to have close coordination and cooperation or consultation between the two sides, especially between all these 5 members of this BRICS group. So we have to be confident that to wait for more successful result and good positive outcomes of this event next week.
Right, Ali Khan, financing seems to be top of the model here.
Yes, absolutely, and it was a huge problem for Africa. If you remember the 90s boom bust, commodity prices would go up, they'd collapse, our economies would collapse. China brought a longer term, better price structure for our commodities. That unleashed capital. Now we're seeing China saying, you know, okay, we put in the safety net, now we can really help you and boost you. At this moment in time, we've got challenges in many different African countries, Angola, for example. So I think China has got to put some money to work. I think BRICS has got to be seen to be supporting us. And I think this has been a uniquely positive relationship for the African continent. And therefore, it is, for me, far more important what happens in China at this BRICS meeting than what's happening in Washington or what's happening in other capitals, which historically we had a stronger relationship with.
All right, Ali Khan, we'll leave it there for the moment, and that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests in there for their insights. In Beijing, Professor Liu Xixin, he's a senior fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China. With me in studio in Nairobi, Ali Khan Sachu, CEO of Rich Management. Thank you for your insights. And remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.